What's happening across America right now isn't loud, chaotic, or announced at a podium. It's quiet, calculated, and deeply uncomfortable once you start paying attention. Families don't wake up one day and decide to leave communities they've built roots in for decades. They leave because staying becomes harder than going. Higher rents, fewer protections, tighter rules, colder systems, and somehow every change is framed as normal, economic, or just the way things are. Welcome to 10 states that are pushing out minorities without saying it. An investigation into how housing pressure, immigration policy, urban development, and political decision-making can quietly reshape who belongs and who doesn't. This isn't about discrimination with a megaphone. It's about systemic racism, economic disparity, and gentrification operating behind legal language and budget sheets, while cultural diversity and civil rights get treated like optional add-ons. What makes this moment dangerous is how easy it is to miss. No protests required, no public statements needed, just a series of policies that disproportionately impact marginalized communities, restrict access, and slowly drain opportunity, until people pack up, move on, or never move in at all. And when the population changes, the narrative changes with it. In this countdown, we're breaking down the patterns, the warning signs, and the social shifts that rarely get discussed in relocation videos or political talking points. If you care about equality, minority rights, social justice, or simply understanding where America is heading, this is a conversation you can't ignore. Watch closely, stay to the end, and if this content matters to you, subscribe to Virtual Travel by Brian, drop a comment, and share this video, because silence has consequences too. Number 10. Hawaii. Let's start this countdown in a place everyone thinks they want to live. Hawaii. Sunsets, beaches, year-round good vibes, and Instagram backgrounds that make mainland life look like a bad decision. But here's the twist nobody puts in the relocation brochure. Hawaii is paradise, until your paycheck realizes it's not invited. Hawaii consistently ranks among the highest housing cost-burdened states in the entire country, according to housing research groups like the University of Minnesota's RHRC. Translation? A massive share of residents, especially renters, are spending well over 30% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And when housing eats your paycheck first, everything else starts fighting over scraps. Now let's talk reality. Median home prices routinely hover in the stratosphere. Rents rival luxury markets on the mainland, and wages didn't get the memo. Service workers, hospitality staff, teachers, healthcare aides, many of the jobs that keep Hawaii running simply don't pay enough to survive long-term. So what happens? People double up, then triple up, then they leave. And when leaving isn't an option, homelessness becomes the last stop. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Hawaii experienced one of the fastest growth rates in homelessness between 2023 and 2024, driven largely by, you guessed it, affordability pressures. This isn't about personal failure. This is math. When rent rises faster than income, the outcome is predictable every single time. Here's where the quiet push-out comes in. Hawaii doesn't pass laws saying certain people aren't welcome. It doesn't need to. The Paradise Tax does the job beautifully. High housing costs, high utilities, high food prices, because shipping everything across the ocean isn't free, and limited land for new development create a system where only the wealthy or the already established can stay comfortable. And let's be honest, who gets squeezed first when prices explode? Minority communities, working-class families, and long-time local residents with the least generational wealth to absorb the shock. Over time, the population shifts not because anyone was banned, but because staying became financially impossible. So Hawaii ends up with a strange contradiction. A place celebrated for cultural diversity, but structured in a way that slowly erodes who can actually afford to live there. Aloha spirit on the surface, eviction notices underneath. That's why Hawaii lands at number 10. Not because it's hostile in words, but because paradise has a price, and the bill keeps going up. Number 9. Massachusetts. Massachusetts loves to brand itself as progressive, educated, and inclusive. And on paper, it is. Strong institutions, world-class universities, and a reputation for opportunity. But here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. You don't have to ban people when a two-bedroom costs what a small mortgage used to. Let's talk numbers before feelings. Research from housing analysts at the University of Minnesota's RHRC consistently places Massachusetts among the states with some of the highest housing cost burden rates in the country. That means a huge share of residents, especially renters, are spending well over 30% of their income just on housing. And once you cross that line, every other expense starts feeling like a personal attack. What makes this worse is that this isn't just a Boston problem anymore. According to analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the housing affordability crisis is spreading beyond the core cities into suburbs and smaller communities across New England. Translation: the old escape routes are gone. The move 30 minutes out strategy doesn't work when the suburbs are just as expensive and supply is just as tight. Housing scarcity is the silent villain here. Limited new construction, restrictive zoning, and intense demand from high-earning sectors collide into a perfect storm. When supply can't keep up, prices don't just rise, they launch. And the people who get priced out first are the same groups every time: working-class families, young households, and minority communities who don't have generational wealth to cushion the blow. Now add the cultural layer. Massachusetts attracts talent from everywhere, but staying is another story. You can land a decent job, do everything right, and still realize your paycheck disappears into rent, utilities, and transportation before life even begins. Saving? Owning? Stability? Those become long-term fantasies rather than realistic goals. This is where the quiet push-out happens. No speeches, no angry laws. Just a housing market that politely but firmly says, if you're not already established, this might not be for you. Over time, people don't protest, they relocate. And when enough people leave or never arrive, the demographics shift without a single headline. Massachusetts doesn't lose its diversity overnight. It loses it slowly, one lease renewal at a time. The state still talks inclusion, but the price of entry keeps climbing, and the door keeps getting narrower. That's why Massachusetts lands at number 9, not because it's loud about exclusion, but because housing scarcity can quietly do what laws never have to. Number 8. California. California doesn't sound like a place that would push anyone out. In fact, it markets itself as the opposite. Diversity, inclusion, opportunity, golden dreams under endless sunshine. And culturally, California absolutely believes in those things. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Affordability doesn't care about your values, and it can exclude people just as effectively as policy ever could. Let's start with the numbers, because California's housing situation isn't a vibe, it's a crisis. Research from housing analysts at the University of Minnesota's RHRC shows some of the highest housing cost burdens in the nation are concentrated in western states, including California. Translation: millions of residents are spending far more than the recommended 30% of their income just to exist indoors. Rent, mortgages, property taxes, it all stacks up fast. And when the math stops working, people make a move. According to reporting from the San Francisco Chronicle, California continues to experience significant net domestic outmigration, with hundreds of thousands of residents leaving for other states year after year. Yes, international immigration offsets some of that loss. But that doesn't change the reality that longtime residents are packing up and heading out because staying has become financially exhausting. Now layer in insurance instability. In many parts of California, homeowners insurance has become harder to get, more expensive, or flat out unavailable due to wildfire risk. Some residents are pushed into last resort plans with higher premiums and less coverage. Others just cross California off their future plans entirely. When housing is expensive and risky, the stress multiplier kicks in. Here's where the quiet push-out becomes clear. California isn't anti-minority in branding or rhetoric, but affordability has a bias. People with less accumulated wealth, often minority households due to historic income and ownership gaps, feel the squeeze first. When rents spike, they don't just tighten budgets, they erase options. And when options disappear, relocation becomes the only realistic solution. What makes this especially ironic is that California still attracts talent, creativity, and global diversity. But staying long enough to benefit from that opportunity increasingly requires either high income, family support, or a willingness to sacrifice long-term stability. Not everyone has that luxury. So California ends up exporting something it claims to value deeply: its own people. Teachers, service workers, artists, young families, many of them minorities, leave not because they're unwelcome, but because the price of participation keeps rising. That's why California lands at number 8. Not because it shouts exclusion, but because when the cost of living becomes the gatekeeper, values alone don't keep people in the room. Number 7. Mississippi. Mississippi doesn't usually make headlines for subtlety, but when it comes to pushing people out, the strategy here isn't loud economics or flashy housing markets, it's something quieter and arguably more damaging: representation barriers. Because when people feel like their voices don't count, they don't always protest. Sometimes they just leave. Here's the key issue. In 2024, a federal judge ruled that Mississippi's judicial electoral map violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, finding that it diluted black voting power. The court ordered remedies, though the case sits within a broader and still evolving national legal fight over voting rights. Translation in plain English? Large black populations existed, but the political power didn't match the population. And that mismatch wasn't accidental. This is where Mississippi's quiet push-out formula kicks in. If communities can't translate population into representation, they lose confidence that staying will change anything. Voting starts to feel ceremonial instead of powerful. Civic engagement turns into civic exhaustion. Now let's be clear, Mississippi isn't banning anyone from voting outright. That would be too obvious. Instead, district lines, electoral structures, and judicial maps do the heavy lifting. You show up, you vote, and then you watch the same outcomes repeat themselves, cycle after cycle. Over time, that wears people down. And when political influence feels blocked, everything else follows. Infrastructure investment slows, school funding debates stall, criminal justice reform goes nowhere. Communities start feeling invisible, not because they aren't there, but because the system isn't built to reflect them. And that sense of invisibility becomes a powerful motivator to look elsewhere. Mississippi already struggles with outmigration, especially among younger residents and professionals. For black residents in particular, the calculation becomes brutal. Why stay in a place where your presence doesn't translate into power, progress, or protection? You can love your roots and still recognize when the soil isn't producing anything new. What makes this especially ironic is that Mississippi's black population isn't small or marginal. It's significant, historic, and deeply woven into the state's identity. Yet when electoral systems fail to reflect that reality, the message received isn't subtle at all. It says, your numbers exist, but your influence doesn't. And here's the part people don't like to admit. Representation isn't just symbolic. It affects whether people believe their future can improve where they are. When that belief fades, relocation starts to look less like abandonment and more like self-preservation. That's why Mississippi lands at number 7. Not because people are being chased out, but because when democracy feels decorative instead of functional, hope quietly packs its bags. Number 6. Tennessee. Tennessee has been having a moment. Music City glow-ups, booming job growth, shiny downtown cranes, and a reputation for being business-friendly. On the surface, it looks like opportunity is knocking. But dig a little deeper and you'll notice something else quietly happening. People doing the math and deciding it's not worth answering the door. Tennessee's quiet push-out formula is a two-step. First, a broad anti-sanctuary environment. Advocacy groups like the Immigration Legal Resource Center flagged Tennessee as one of the states with sweeping anti-sanctuary laws that expand cooperation between local authorities and federal immigration enforcement. Now, nobody has to say, "You're not welcome." The rules say enough. Even lawful immigrants and mixed-status families start weighing risk versus reward in everyday life. Traffic stops, paperwork, uncertainty. Stress becomes part of the cost of living. Then comes the second punch. Affordability shifts in fast-growing metros. Nashville, in particular, has transformed at lightning speed. Growth brings jobs, sure, but it also brings rent hikes, tighter vacancy rates, and speculative housing markets. According to National Housing Research from the Joint Center for Housing Studies, renters are consistently the first to feel the squeeze when markets heat up, and minority households are disproportionately represented among renters nationwide. Translation? When rents spike, the pressure doesn't land evenly. So you get this perfect storm. A policy environment that feels less forgiving, paired with a housing market that's suddenly asking luxury prices for basic living. And when both of those hit at once, people don't need a formal notice. They start asking quiet questions. Is this still affordable? Is this still safe? Is this still worth it? What makes Tennessee's situation especially sneaky is how reasonable each piece sounds on its own. Tough immigration laws framed as law and order, housing prices framed as growth. But stack them together, and the outcome looks very different. Working-class families, service workers, creatives, and longtime residents find themselves pushed to the margins or pushed out altogether. And let's not ignore the irony. The same cities celebrating cultural growth and national attention are slowly pricing out the very diversity that made them attractive in the first place. Music, food, community, those don't survive on six-figure salaries alone. They survive on people being able to live near where they work. That's why Tennessee lands at number 6. Not because it says don't come, but because when the rules feel tighter and the rent jumps, people do the math, and the answer is often to leave. We're halfway through the countdown. If you are enjoying the video so far, hit the like button, subscribe to Virtual Travel by Brian, and ring the notification bell for more informative content. Let's get back into it. Number 5. Iowa. Iowa doesn't usually enter the national conversation about exclusion. It's marketed as calm, affordable, and sensible. Flyover country, where life is simple and drama is optional. But here's the thing about quiet places. When policy shifts happen there, they don't come with sirens. They come with paperwork. And Iowa's quiet push-out formula is doing exactly that. Start with enforcement. Iowa's listed among states with aggressive anti-sanctuary frameworks, according to immigration policy trackers like the Immigration Legal Resource Center. That means deeper cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration authorities. On paper, it's framed as rule of law. In real life, it creates a climate where immigrants, including legal residents and mixed-status families, feel like daily life comes with extra risk. Traffic stops feel heavier, interactions feel colder, and stress becomes a background noise you can't turn off. Then comes the second layer: higher education. Iowa is also among the states that moved to ban or restrict DEI offices at public universities, part of a broader culture war wave documented by outlets like Inside Higher Ed. Support programs gone, cultural centers stripped back, language around inclusion suddenly treated like a problem instead of a tool. And universities matter here, because they're often the front door for newcomers, young professionals, and upwardly mobile families. Put those two together, and the message becomes clear without ever being spoken. When newcomers hear the state is cracking down and campuses are cutting inclusion infrastructure, the easiest choice is choose another state. What makes Iowa's situation especially ironic is that the state actually needs newcomers. Population growth is slow. Many communities want young workers, healthcare professionals, and students to stay after graduation, but policies don't exist in isolation. People look at the whole picture. And if that picture says you can come here, but don't expect support, protection, or representation, they keep scrolling. This is how quiet pushouts work. Nobody gets banned. Nobody gets shouted at. Instead, opportunity feels conditional. Belonging feels temporary. And staying feels like swimming upstream against systems that don't see you as a priority. For minority students and professionals, especially those without deep family roots or generational safety nets, Iowa becomes a trial period instead of a long-term plan. Graduate, gain experience, then relocate somewhere that feels less tense and more invested in your presence. So Iowa lands at number 5 not because it's loud about exclusion, but because policy signals matter. And when those signals stack up, people don't wait around to see how it ends. They leave quietly, just like the message told them to. Number 4. Georgia. Georgia loves to talk about momentum, and to be fair, the economy is booming. New jobs, corporate relocations, population growth, and skyline glow-ups have turned parts of the state into a southern success story. But here's the quiet part people notice once they stay a little longer. Growth doesn't always mean welcome, and policy signals still decide who feels comfortable planting roots. Georgia's quiet, push-out formula starts with aggressive anti-sanctuary enforcement. According to immigration policy trackers like the Immigration Legal Resource Center, Georgia is among the states with comprehensive laws that pull local agencies deeper into federal immigration enforcement. On paper, it's framed as cooperation and compliance. In practice, it creates uncertainty, especially for immigrant families and mixed-status households. Everyday life starts coming with extra calculation. Is this interaction worth the risk? Is this state really where we want to build long-term stability? Then comes the second layer, ongoing voting law battles. Georgia has been at the center of national attention for restrictive voting changes, tracked by organizations like the Brennan Center for Justice. The debates aren't abstract. They affect access, participation, and trust. When communities feel their political voice is being narrowed or constantly contested, it sends a subtle but powerful message about who the system is designed to work for. Here's where the contradiction kicks in. Georgia needs diversity to fuel its growth. Atlanta's cultural influence, Black entrepreneurship, immigrant labor, and young professionals are major drivers of the state's economic success. But while the billboards say open for business, the policies quietly whisper, just don't get too comfortable. And that tension matters. People don't just choose where to live based on jobs anymore. They choose based on stability, representation, and whether the rules feel like they could shift against them tomorrow. When immigration enforcement feels tighter and voting access feels fragile, staying long-term starts to feel like a gamble rather than a plan. Nobody is being chased out of Georgia. That's not how this works. Instead, people arrive excited, then hesitate. They take the job, but delay buying a home. They build community, but keep exit options open. Over time, that hesitation turns into quiet outmigration, or decisions never to arrive at all. Georgia's situation is especially telling because it shows how economic success doesn't cancel out social signals. You can have growth, opportunity, and diversity all at once, and still undermine who feels safe enough to stay. That's why Georgia lands at number 4. Not because it's failing, but because when policy signals clash with progress, people start questioning whether the future they're helping build includes them. Number 3. Alabama. Alabama doesn't announce exclusion with banners or headlines. It prefers something quieter, something procedural, something that looks neutral on paper but lands very differently in real life. And that's exactly why Alabama earns the number 3 spot on this list. Let's start with enforcement. Alabama is identified by groups like the Immigration Legal Resource Center as having broad, aggressive anti-sanctuary laws with significant negative effects on immigrants. These policies deepen cooperation between local authorities and federal immigration enforcement. Officially, it's about law and order. Unofficially, it creates a climate of constant calculation, especially for immigrant families, mixed-status households, and even long-term residents who just don't want unnecessary attention attached to everyday life. But enforcement alone isn't the full story. The second half of Alabama's quiet push-out formula plays out in public institutions, especially education. In 2024, Alabama implemented a ban on DEI programs in public universities, a move widely reported and actively contested by educators and civil rights advocates. Critics argue the ban chills campus climate, removes support structures, and sends a clear signal about what kinds of conversations and identities are no longer welcome in academic spaces. Now pause and think about what that looks like to families making decisions. Schools matter. Universities matter. They're not just classrooms. They're pipelines. They tell people whether a state is investing in their future or tolerating their presence. And when the message at school and in public systems is, don't talk about identity, don't support identity, families don't argue forever, they relocate. Here's the irony. Alabama wants talent. It wants doctors, engineers, teachers, and students to stay. But talent tends to be mobile, and mobility comes with options. When other states are offering not just jobs but support systems, representation, and stability, Alabama's approach starts to feel less competitive and more restrictive. The push-out here isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. First, everyday interactions feel heavier. Then campus environments feel colder. Then support networks quietly disappear. At no point does anyone say, you don't belong. But the systems do a great job of implying it, and over time people stop trying to decode the message. They listen to it. That's why Alabama lands at number 3. Not because it loudly rejects diversity, but because when enforcement tightens and institutions retreat from inclusion, silence becomes the loudest policy of all. Number 2, Florida. Florida sells a very convincing fantasy. Sunshine, beaches, palm trees, and the promise that life is easier when winter doesn't exist. On vacation, Florida feels welcoming to everyone. But living there? That's where the fine print shows up. Because Florida can feel great on a postcard, until your paperwork, your zip code, or your politics enter the conversation. Florida's quiet push-out formula starts with anti-sanctuary-style immigration enforcement. Groups like the Immigration Legal Resource Center consistently cite Florida as having one of the more aggressive enforcement frameworks in the country, increasing local entanglement with deportation pipelines. The official language is compliance. The lived experience is caution. Immigrants, documented or not, and mixed-status families begin to live with a low-grade anxiety that turns normal routines into risk assessments. When that stress becomes permanent, relocation starts to feel like relief. Then there's the second layer, voting access controversies. Florida remains a recurring feature in national voting rights debates, with restrictive election rules frequently litigated and analyzed by organizations like the Brennan Center for Justice. Whether it's ballot access, restoration of voting rights, or shifting election procedures, the signal many communities receive is uncertainty. And when people feel their political voice is fragile or conditional, it chips away at their sense of belonging. Now add the third punch: rising cost burdens. Florida used to be marketed as affordable sunshine. That brand has cracked. Housing prices and rents have surged in many metros. Insurance costs have exploded, and everyday expenses keep climbing. The result? Working-class households and renters, who are disproportionately minorities nationwide, get squeezed first. Paradise starts charging luxury prices for basic stability. What makes Florida especially effective at pushing people out quietly is that none of these pressures arrive alone. They stack. A tighter enforcement climate plus voting access fights plus rising living costs create a situation where staying requires emotional energy, financial flexibility, and political tolerance. Not everyone has all three. And here's the irony. Florida still attracts millions of newcomers, but attraction doesn't equal retention. People arrive excited, then realize daily life feels different than the brochure promised. They don't leave angry. They leave tired. They leave cautious. They leave quietly. Florida doesn't need to say you're not welcome. The system does enough talking. When communities start feeling watched, unheard, and overcharged all at once, the decision to move stops being political. It becomes practical. That's why Florida lands at number 2. Not because it scares people away loudly, but because when sunshine meets scrutiny, affordability meets anxiety, and rights feel conditional, the welcome mat starts curling at the edges. Number 1, Texas. Texas didn't stumble into the top spot on this list. It earned it, quietly, efficiently, and without ever needing to post a "not welcome" sign. Because Texas doesn't have to ban anyone. The climate can do the work. Let's start with the elephant wearing cowboy boots: aggressive immigration enforcement. Texas's SB 4 attempted to create a state crime for illegal entry and empower state-level enforcement, a move civil rights groups warned would create fear not just for undocumented immigrants, but for mixed-status families and even lawful residents worried about profiling. When a state takes that approach, the impact travels far beyond who the law technically targets. The atmosphere changes. Everyday life turns into calculation. And here's the real-life effect that doesn't show up in legal briefs. Even if you're fully legal, when a state gets aggressive, everyday life turns into stress math. What if I get stopped? What if my cousin gets flagged? What if helping a family member puts me on someone's radar? People don't argue those questions forever. They move where they feel normal. Now layer in housing. Texas used to sell itself as the affordable alternative to coastal chaos. That brand is aging fast. Major metros like Austin, Dallas, Houston, and parts of San Antonio have seen dramatic housing cost increases, pricing out renters and first-time buyers at record speed. The math no longer works for many working-class households, and nationally, renters and cost-burdened households are disproportionately minorities. When rent jumps and wages don't keep pace, relocation becomes a financial survival strategy. Then comes the third pressure point: voting access fights. Texas has remained a central player in national debates over restrictive voting laws and election access. Whether you follow the details closely or not, the message many communities receive is simple. Participation feels harder, representation feels thinner, and trust feels conditional. That matters. When people feel politically sidelined and economically squeezed at the same time, they stop betting on long-term roots. Here's what makes Texas especially effective at quiet pushout. It doesn't need to ban anyone. It doesn't need explicit exclusion. The climate does the work. Enforcement pressure creates fear. Housing pressure creates displacement. Voting fights create disengagement. None of these alone force people out, but together they make staying exhausting. And yet Texas keeps growing. Newcomers arrive every day. But growth isn't the same as retention. Longtime residents, minority families, and working professionals quietly exit, not in protest, but in self-preservation. That's why Texas lands at number 1. Not because it says you don't belong, but because when policy pressure, affordability stress, and civic uncertainty collide, people don't wait for permission to leave. And that brings us back to the bigger question of this entire countdown. If no one ever tells you to go, but everything around you makes staying harder, isn't that still being pushed out? If this breakdown made you pause, rethink, or recognize patterns you've lived through, make sure you're subscribed to Virtual Travel by Brian. I break down the realities behind relocation, policy, and cost of living trends that don't make it into glossy brochures. Watch the next video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone deciding where to live next, because where you live shouldn't feel like a constant negotiation.